All right, so we are finishing up our last question on our 3 John, the Gaius, Diotrephes, and Demetrius notes. It's the characteristics that we want or do not want to imitate from these three. We ended last week talking about Gaius, and we looked at there was nothing bad said about Gaius. For that matter, there's nothing bad said about Demetrius. Specifically, what John brings out about Gaius is his showing his love to the brethren, those brethren certainly who were there, but also the brethren passing through, who were seeking to teach the gospel. Gaius took care of them. He led sent them on their journey with presumably food and with having a place to stay and whatnot. And John affirmed and commended the faith and love of Gaius. And certainly that is a characteristic we should imitate and seek to imitate from Gaius. And then Diotrephes, there's nothing good said about Diotrephes. Not a single thing. And certainly we need to be aware of the fact that Diotrephes had an ego problem. Okay, he sought to be the one everybody listened to, everybody looked to, and he wanted to be kind of in charge, it would seem. And apparently the brethren, for whatever reason, let him. Whether he was very charismatic or whatnot, he was kind of in charge. In fact, he made the rules. He even made the rule that if you took in these teachers of the gospel, that he would kick you out of that congregation. So it's certainly the things that he is doing are not according to the truth. He will not listen to the words of the apostles. He doesn't want the brethren to hear from any other people outside. He just kind of wants to have his control there and to maintain it. And we talked about the possible link between the Nicolaitans and people like Diotrephes, not to say that he was a Nicolaitan, but the fact that the phrase itself, Nicolaitans, has connections to manipulation through religion, okay? Manipulation through spiritual means, seeking to control others. And so it could very well be that that was some connection there. And then, of course, we talked about Demetrius with regard to the fact that he has a good testimony from all and the truth itself. We also bear witness, our testimony is true. And the fact that we should seek for someone to be able to say about us that even the truth itself bears witness that this individual is a faithful servant of God. Now, there's two main points I want to bring out, both one about Demetrius and one about Gaius. With Demetrius, it's not just enough that Demetrius has a good testimony from all, or that the apostles could bear witness, but that the truth itself could bear witness. How does that go further than just what people said about him and what the apostles said about him? Saying the fact that Demetrius has a good testimony from the truth itself, what does that mean?
I would interpret that as he goes up to the standard of the truth.
Okay.
That he is evidence of the truth, he's a reflection of the truth.
Okay. And will that be true only when he's around his brethren? Is he putting on a mask, a facade? John doesn't seem to think so. Even the truth bears witness. And I think there's a very important application here that Demetrius, for instance, was not just a Christian on Sunday and Wednesday nights. Okay, he wasn't just someone who showed up, appeared to be faithful, or when he was around his brethren, put on a good show that he was faithful, but then in his personal life away from everybody else, he did what he wanted. Okay, at least John, inspired by the Holy Spirit, doesn't seem to think that's the case. He says the truth itself bears witness. And it kind of creates an interesting question, reflective question for us, is would our brethren think that we have a good testimony? Would our family think we have a good testimony and proclaim to be a follower of Christ? Would the truth itself bear witness that we are a good servant of God, or that we have a good testimony? That's a very different question than just what other people perceive. The truth itself is reality, the reality of the situation 24 hours a day. Do I have a good testimony? something that even the truth itself could bear witness that I'm doing what God wants me to do. And I think that's a really, it's a very strong statement about Demetrius' character that we have to ask ourselves, could the same be said about me? Okay. Anything about Demetrius? Yes, sir.
Just reading through this reminded me of 1 John, the times John talks about witnessing. He puts them in threes, right? There are the three bear witness in heaven, the three on the earth.
Yep.
And there just seems to be a point out of that. Again, here he lists three witnesses, a completeness.
Yes. Yeah.
Not just one where you might doubt it, and two is a little more verified, but these three distinct witnesses, if you will.
That's right. Even Paul would reference, having two or three witnesses, how let every word be established. He mentions that to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1. So there's something about, especially even hearkening back to the old law, having that number of witnesses or appealing to that number of witnesses, that certainly does carry with it that sense of a complete, a fullness, a full understanding or testimony. Yeah. Anything else about Demetrius? Yes, sir.
I'm thinking of 1 Thessalonians, Paul was commending the brethren in the 1st chapter.
Yep.
He says, they became an example unto all that believe in Macedonia and Achaia, for from you hath sounded forth the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but in every place your faith in Yahweh has gone forth, so that we need not speak anything.
Yeah.
We didn't need to speak anything. Their conduct and their example was a testimony to all.
That's right. And Paul says something similar to the Romans in Romans chapter 1 about how your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Okay, through the entire body of Christ in Ephesus and Philippi, everybody knew of the faith of the brethren in Rome. So yeah, absolutely. Paul appeals to the examples that brethren set routinely and acknowledges their faith, commends them for their faith. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so there's one other thing that I want to point out, particularly a characteristic that we should want to imitate from Gaius. Okay, and this is kind of combining what we read about Gaius and what we read about Diotrephes. Now, what is Gaius doing in spite of the threat from Diotrephes?
Showing hospitality, still receiving those who come.
Okay. Now, John doesn't go into detail about whether or not Diotrephes had actually kicked Gaius out of that congregation or not. John doesn't really say anything about that. But what we do know is that Gaius forbids those who wish to show hospitality to these passing brethren, putting them out of the church. Of course, if anybody would know that, I would assume Gaius certainly would know that. But what's interesting to me is that Gaius is taking care of these brethren despite the threat from Diotrephes. And what does that imply? Yes, sir.
As we read about some of the apostles early in the book of Acts, we ought to obey God rather than men.
Okay.
Gaius is an example of that.
Yeah. Gaius is willing to and it also shows that I don't want to call the brethren where they are gullible or anything like that, but for whatever reason, they're allowing Diotrephes to control things. Gaius is not taken into that, whatever the charisma is, whatever the teaching is from Diotrephes. Gaius is not being taken over by that. He knows the truth, and he knows that he is supposed to take care of these traveling brethren who are teaching the gospel. That's what he's supposed to do. And so he's doing it despite what Diotrephes said. And isn't there also perhaps a lesson there about being faithful in the face of peer pressure? Okay, Diotrephes, whatever authority he had yielded for himself before these brethren, the fact is, among these brethren, it would appear he does have authority. Not lawfully according to the law of God, but he does wield influence. And the fact that Gaius is willing to do this anyway speaks to the fact that he's not concerned about what Diotrephes thinks. He's not concerned about people tattling on him. He's going to do what's right, regardless of what Diotrephes threatens to do to him, kicking him out of the congregation or whatever. He's going to stand up for what's right. And I think that's a great example of faith in the face of peer pressure. Attempting to be pressured, to be threatened. And of course the Jews did this. We talked about this last time. the Jews threatened to kick people out of the synagogue if they followed Jesus and so forth. It was an attempt to assert control. And of course, that's not to say necessarily that Gaius is the only one. Okay, it's possible there are other brethren where they are that are also doing this, perhaps in secret, perhaps they're doing it without Diotrephes knowing, perhaps they don't care if Diotrephes knows. We don't have a lot of background on that. But Gaius certainly is standing up to this evil influence that Diotrephes has. Go ahead, Snoop.
Sometimes when we use the word peer pressure, I don't think that we always relate it to a relationship. Peer pressure is about being concerned about that relationship. And he was more concerned about his relationship with God. And so he was forward thinking and not, I'm going to use the word temporal, it's not necessarily, but he was long-term thinking opposed to short-term thinking. If I give it to Diotrephes, that's short-term, and there's a lot of negative consequences opposed to my relationship with God, my relationship with these visiting Christians. I mean, it's easier said than done sometimes, but peer pressure is about a relationship. And the more we're bonded to God and to Christ, the less impact negative humans are going to have on us.
And what's interesting about that too is part of what Diotrephes is threatening appeals to the more social element of it, being around the brethren, as opposed to the spiritual element of fellowship, which John says in 1 John chapter 1 is based on whether or not I'm walking in the light, as God is in the light. And so certainly Gaius understood that even if Diotrephes were to remove him or to forbid him from coming to that congregation anymore or whatever, he still has fellowship with the apostles, he has fellowship with the wider brethren, with Christ, because he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. And so that's a great point to make on that. Yeah. Anything else? All right. So that's the end of our notes on Gaius, Diotrephes, and Demetrius from 3 John. Sometimes 3 John doesn't really get talked about or discussed, and there's really three great examples, one of which is a great negative example for us to be able to view and to understand in regard to how we're supposed to serve God. All right, so let's move on to Gideon. Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8 deal with Gideon. Now, we're not going to read all of Judges 6, 7, and 8. We did that kind of with Samson because there was a lot there with Samson to try to unpack. And it almost feels like you're not doing due service to the effort to study his character when almost every single event that we have recorded about Samson says something about his character. Gideon, certainly you could make the same claim about Gideon, but there's it's a little bit more linear in terms of his character, showing his faith in God and so forth. And so we are going to read a little bit here in chapter 6, and then we're going to kind of zone in on very specific things in chapter 7 and chapter 8. So here's we have these facts that I list there at the very beginning before we start getting into the study on the notes. He is the 5th judge over Israel. He was after Deborah. This puts him somewhere in between 1350 and 1100 BC, within that range or so forth. His name means feller. Not, hey, that feller over there. It's feller of trees, meaning destroyer or mighty warrior. When I first saw that in Strong's, it just said feller. And I'm like, well, he's a feller, okay? But I had to look up more detail there. It says he's a feller of trees, which implies he's a destroyer, a warrior, that sort of thing, or that's what his name represents. He was of the tribe of Manasseh. Of course, he's going to relay that here in chapter 6. We're going to find in verses 11 and 12, he's secretly threshing wheat when an angel comes to him. He's also known as Jerubbaal, and we see that in chapter 6 later on here in verse 32. And if anybody remembers, we had a daily devotion about a month and a half ago, where we talked about the name Jerubbaal. Does anybody remember what that was about, if you watched it? It's kind of interesting because they found archaeological, it was a jar. Okay, it was a jar. They think it had some kind of expensive perfume or cologne or some kind of expensive liquid in it, and it had the name Jerubbaal on it. And the name Jerubbaal itself, it would not lend itself to a name that people would choose to have. In fact, it's written in the Canaanite language. And it's certainly not a name that any Canaanite would want. And we'll understand why here in chapter 6. So it's very interesting, the article that we looked at. It was an article coming out of, I think it was the Jerusalem Archaeological Academy or whatever, but they think that jar may have belonged to Gideon, or at the very least had some connection to him, which I think is very interesting. So we'll talk more about that when we get to verse 32. All right, starting in verse 1 to kind of get some of the background of what's happening here. It says, "Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years, and the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. So it was, whenever Israel had sown, Midianites would come up. Also Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. Then they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number, and they would enter the land to destroy it. So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And it came to pass, when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, who said to them, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you out of the house of bondage. I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you their land. Also I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice." Okay, so we kind of see a pattern with Israel where when they have a judge who comes on the scene and they are judging them for a period of 20, 30, 40 years, it seems like everything's good, but then what happens? What happens? Okay, and why do they do that? What happens to the judge? They die. It seems like every single time they have a judge and everything's going well, and then that judge dies. And then for a period of time, they turn their back on God. They do what they want. Now all of a sudden bad things happen. They cry out to the Lord, and the Lord sends another deliverer. And this is a cycle that keeps repeating through judges. And God sends a prophet to remind them of the fact, listen, you have not listened to me. This is why I'm allowing this stuff to happen to you. And it says a prophet was sent. No name. In fact, there's a couple of examples in the Old Testament where a prophet is sent, and there's no name attached to them. So we don't know who exactly they were or what their whole story was. But in this case, we have this prophet declaring to Israel that you are not obeying my voice. This is why this has happened. Of course, God's going to come to Gideon. He's going to make it a little for him.
Just interesting, this appearance of this prophet and his message. It just seems to me his purpose was just to bring it to their attention.
Yeah.
Like you're not aware that you forgot God, even though you've been doing this over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
He doesn't pronounce a punishment or anything. Just
No. And he doesn't say anything about how God is now going to send you a deliverer either. From what's recorded here. Yeah. It's interesting. It's kind of like okay, let's remind you of what your situation is and why it is that way. It's kind of all that was. And then starting in verse 11, so the angel of the Lord came, or now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abizrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. So now we kind of understand why Gideon is in the winepress, but instead of pressing wine, what is he doing? Threshing wheat. Okay, they don't want the Midianites or any of the others to find out that they've got it and come and take it. Verse 12, Now the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, "O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." It's interesting because usually the scriptures will give us some kind of a description or some way in which these individuals react to these angels. It appears that this angel of the Lord in verse 12, it doesn't sound necessarily like he's some glowing apparition or anything like that. Often, and in fact, every time in the Old Testament that an angel appears, it usually appears as a man. Okay, sometimes 2 or 3 of them will appear, and they appear as men. And it takes a little while for people to realize that these men are angels. Gideon, he says, "Oh my Lord, if the Lord's with us, why has all this happened?" Okay, we've been told about the miracles of Jehovah, and I think that's kind of an interesting situation that Gideon is in, where he's grown up hearing about the miracles of Jehovah. He's grown up hearing about God and how that he led them out of Egypt, but he hasn't seen any, and presumably none have been done recently enough for him to have been a witness to them. And so he's kind of, well, God has forsaken us, and he doesn't take care of us anymore.
Very quickly, too, the first one tongue-in-cheek, in verse 13 there, the King James, perhaps a better, his name means feller. Why has all this befallen us? Timing of his name.
Befeller, right? Yeah.
But secondly, him asking for where are all the miracles? We're going to find the same thing in Jesus' day, right? A number of things have been done. There's ample reason for faith and belief. People still looking for one more thing, or the specific thing,
right,
maybe that I need to see.
Right. Although it is interesting to note, and of course I don't know that anybody had at this point, but it's interesting to note that does Gideon still believe Jehovah exists? It would seem so. He refers to Jehovah. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. It's not that Jehovah's not there. It's that the Lord isn't taking care of us. He's forsaken us. And of course, God said he did, and here's why. You're not obeying my word anymore. In verse 14, then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" 2 things that this angel says, and it's the Lord speaking through the angel. That's why the Lord turned to him and said. It's not God in the flesh on earth or anything like that. It's the Lord through the angel, just as the Lord spoke through the angel in the burning bush to Moses. But notice there are 2 things that he says that are curious. The first thing he says about Gideon is that he's a mighty man of what?
Valor.
Of valor. You mighty man of valor, verse 12. Has Gideon shown any evidence of being a mighty man of valor? Not yet, not as far as we know. Okay, and then in verse 14, go in this might of yours. Again, Gideon's not necessarily described as being some great warrior who's just threshing wheat and hasn't, just maybe he's gone out of the picture and he's kind of retired from defeat. He's a young guy. Okay, that's not the situation here. It seems like he's a young guy, and he's going to talk about whether it's an excuse or not. He's going to claim he's the least of his father's house. So in verse 15, he said to him, "O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. You couldn't pick a worse person to try to save Israel." Okay, it seems like Gideon certainly doesn't think much of his abilities. I don't think he's probably shown any abilities as a warrior yet. But he says, of the tribe of Manasseh, and was Manasseh itself really that huge of a tribe? Okay, at this point, it's really half a tribe of Manasseh. But you've got Gideon saying, "Hey, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I am the weakest or the least in my father's house. Anybody would be a better choice." And the Lord said to him, verse 16, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." And so God says, I'm going to be with you. And that's all you need. Yes, sir.
This is a pattern with God.
Yes, it is.
As he chose Moses, he said he wasn't able to speak. You know, David was a young lad.
Yep.
You know, all of these people that are weak.
Yep.
And of course, in the old, when they go forth and, there's commands that, their armies shouldn't be so big, but they've got to be small enough for the enemy to recognize that God, they're not.
It's Jehovah doing it.
It's God doing it. So this is how God is working through Gideon.
Absolutely.
Proving his word and his power to the people.
Absolutely. In fact, and of course we talked about Samson. Samson's always depicted in our children's books and so forth as this big muscular dude. But I'm convinced that he was a scrawny guy. Because that would show that this isn't his own strength that he's doing this. He's not some specimen of a man, muscular and so forth. It's something else is happening here. Yeah, God routinely uses individuals like this to bring about his will. Of course, are they choosing to do it? Okay, so in some cases, God has to convince them, okay, like with Moses. But they choose to do this. Okay, they choose to do what God tells them to do. That's all handsome.
The word comes to mind
Unlikely, an unlikely salvation from an unlikely source. Yeah. Does anything good come out of Nazareth? I mean, time and time again, this is something God does again to show that against all physical logic, God brings about his will and his power is shown. Yeah. All right, so then in verse 17, he said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you. He said, I will wait until you come back. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread with an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought them out to him under the terebinth tree and presented them. The angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. Verse 21, the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Just another context clue that what we're saying, what Gideon is seeing here is a man. He's got a staff, which would have been typical of travelers at the time. He's got a hand, because it references his hand. And the fact that Gideon has to ask, okay? If it were some majestic, glowing angel apparition appearing to him, he might not need to ask. But if it's just someone who looks like a man who's telling him this could be some crazy dude. It should be some hermit crazy guy who's telling me to do this stuff. How do I know that Jehovah is saying this? Now, Gideon in verse 22 perceived that he was the angel of the Lord, because it wouldn't have been obvious necessarily. Otherwise, he just looked like a person. So Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said to him, peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it the Lord is peace. To this day it is still an Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Now it came to pass the same night the Lord told him. So we'll cover that in just a minute. But what we see from Gideon is verse 23 and 20, well, really verse 22 and 23. What do we see from Gideon as a result? Yeah, he's afraid. He's afraid. I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face, and the Lord said to him, verse 23. How did he say this to him? Was it in a thundering voice? Was it through a voice in his head? Did the angel of the Lord appear again? It doesn't say he did, but one way or the other, God spoke to him, spoke to Gideon directly, it would seem, this time. Peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die. Gideon built an altar there. Okay, so it shows kind of Gideon wasn't a hard-hearted person, all right? The fact that he asks this request to make sure this truly is an angel of the Lord, would you consider this a lack of faith, or would you consider this prudent? Yeah. I don't think this is a lack of faith. Some random person walks up to you and starts telling you this is what you're supposed to do, the Lord God says, and he's acting like he's speaking as the Lord. That's kind of weird. And so, yeah, to really put this kind of to the test, so to speak, not that he's testing God, but he wants assurance that this is actually God speaking. Did God provide him that assurance? Yes, he did. Is this going to be the last time God's going to provide him assurance? No, it's not. Yeah, Ben?
That's what I was going to say. He seeks assurance over and over.
Yeah, he does. And, you know, and of course we could say, well, is that a lack of faith? But it's interesting because where is Gideon listed in the New Testament? In Hebrews 11, the chapter of faith. And so it's important to remember that while we would see that as a lack of faith, did God provide him reassurance? Every time he asked, God provided. Yes, sir.
You see examples of people, like here in a few chapters with the Gibeonites. You know, that the reason they made a covenant with them is because they didn't consult the Lord.
Yeah.
They were told to destroy them. That was a lack of faith by not asking.
That's true.
1 Kings 13, that's the old prophet that lied to the man of God.
Yep.
He didn't ask, he should have asked God instead of taking his word for him.
That's right.
He didn't have faith.
Yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of examples where the faith was lacking. Yeah. All right. Yes, ma'am.
This causes me to think of two things. The passage where it says, "Do not fear, you shall not die." Wait, what do you say? Do not fear, you shall not. Oh, peace be with you.
Peace be with you. Do not fear. Yep.
If you think about kind of what Christ told us, I mean, that could be our mantra today in spreading the gospel. He wants us to have peace in Him. He doesn't want us to be fearful, you know. And man can kill our body, but they can't kill our soul.
Yeah.
You know, so to me, that could be our mantra. And then the other thing that I was going to say, I forgot.
Okay. Well, and isn't, you know, Jesus often said peace to you. You know, often Jesus said that because it was to people who were worried about things, or, you know, they were upset after Jesus died. He entered in the room, the upper room, peace to you, don't be afraid. You know, it's a phrase that was common to try to associate some sort of peace, to kind of calm people down. And certainly Gideon is afraid that well, I'm going to die. I've seen the face of the angel of the Lord. And God says, no, you will not die.
I remember what I was going to say. The other thing that came to mind for me is what Gideon did is kind of parallel to what Paul told us. If anyone preaches anything else to you than this gospel,
Yeah.
you know, we're to use the Bible as the standard. If someone comes in preaching something else, we're not to listen to him. And to me, that's what Gideon did. I need to make sure this guy's reading.
Yeah. Well, John tells the saints to test the spirits to see if they're of God. In Revelation chapter 2, was it the church of Ephesus who had tested those who claimed to be apostles, and they were not. They were liars. So yeah, using a standard to determine what is this person truly of God, or in this case, is it an angel? And certainly God gave them, and again, keep in mind, the background of this, Gideon had never seen a miracle. From what we could tell from what he says. Okay, it's been, I've heard about it, I've grown up being told about the miracles Jehovah has performed, but he has never seen one. That doesn't mean he didn't believe in Jehovah. It just means that God had forsaken them. And so in a way, by providing this miracle, that's what it was, fire coming out of the rock to consume this offering, by providing that miracle, it kind of represents, I'm here. Okay, I'm gonna be here for you. I'm gonna take care of you.
And, you know, and he did it so different. He didn't say, "Show me a sign."
Right.
He said, "Let me do this."
Yeah.
And you wait, and I'll be back.
Right.
You know, like I had an encounter with some people a couple of years ago here in Wichita that said they needed money to get home, and I said, "Well, let me put my groceries in the car, and I'll meet you over there at the gas station." Right? They weren't at the gas station when I went over there.
Yeah.
They had left.
Yeah.
You know, because they were not being truthful.
Right. Well, and you're right. You know, that's a really interesting point that Gideon, he didn't tell the angel of the Lord to bring fire out of the rock. he offered this offering, and of course the Lord told him what to do, what to offer, and the Lord did it on his own. Okay, so you're right. Gideon didn't say, now here's what I want you to do. Now in another example, he kind of will, but that'll be different. All right, so verse 25. Now it came to pass the same night, the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it. Build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and offer burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down. So in verse 27, Gideon took 10 men from among his servants. He did as the Lord commanded him. He did it by night and not by day, because he feared his father's household in the midst of the city. Doesn't say anything about whether God was like, why are you afraid, or anything like that. Okay, but keep in mind we're projecting Gideon here as being a young fellow. Okay, so it doesn't say cut him a little bit of slack here that He's grown up hearing these stories of Jehovah, but seeing the first-hand power of Jehovah is something that is a little bit outside of his experience. So it doesn't sound like God holds this against him here in verse 27. Yes, ma'am.
Most of us will avoid conflict.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And that's all he was doing. Like, I can do what I'm told,
Sure.
but I don't have to encounter as much conflict as I would.
Well, and notice something here too. Verse 25. What does God tell him to do? What specific commandment does God give Gideon?
Take your father's young bull.
The young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal. Gideon did exactly as God commanded him. Why God said specifically this second bull of 7 years old? Why specifically that one? Does it matter why? Did Gideon have a problem with it? No. And just like Nadab and Abihu, this is another example of the specificity of God's commandments being followed to the letter, as opposed to Nadab and Abihu, where Gideon did exactly what he was told. Okay, and God doesn't offer an explanation. God doesn't need to offer an explanation. God says the second bull of 7 years, and Gideon says, okay, I'll take it. And then in verse 28, when the men of the city arose early in the morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image that was beside it was cut down. And the second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, who has done this thing? And when they had inquired and asked, they said, Gideon the son of Joash has done this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die, because he's torn down the altar of Baal, because he has cut down the wooden image that was beside it. But Joash, this is Gideon's dad, said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, if Baal is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. Therefore, on that day, he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he has torn down his altar. And this name, Jerubbaal, it's let Baal plead. Can you see that? Let Baal plead. It's a little too small. But, and there's a lot of questions surrounding Joash and whether or not, why did Joash have an altar of Baal and so forth. But there's a lot of wisdom here from Joash as well. Well, hey, who's going to plead for Baal? If Baal is a god and he has power, then let Baal bring judgment on my son. Okay, why would you have to speak for him? But there's some debate, verse 32, whether or not Joash called Gideon Jerubbaal or the people called Gideon Jerubbaal. Because the idea of let Baal plead against him because he's torn down his altar, an alternate rendering of that is may Baal bring judgment upon him. Okay, an alternate rendering of Jerubbaal is may Baal bring judgment on him, or may Baal bring judgment. This is not a name that a Canaanite or a Midianite would want if they were a believer of Baal. Okay? That's a very specific type of name. And that's when I was talking earlier about that article about this pottery shard that has the name Jerubbaal on it. That was not a common name in any way. It would seem to have been very specific. The name Gideon wasn't on there. It was Jerubbaal. And I thought that was really interesting, because who else would have that name? Yeah, Ben?
You kind of see where Gideon gets the way he approaches things from this. His dad is kind of hedging his bets, sort of, and making assurances where he still has a way to go to Jehovah if he needs to, but he's still, you know what I mean?
Well, and apparently he went home to Dad's house too.
Right.
You know, he's in the house. The men are come to Joash, bring him out that we can put him to death. Gideon's in the house. He ain't coming out. So again, all this kind of leads us to the understanding that Gideon, he's a young fella, and you know he needs some reassurances about some things, and of course God's going to provide that. All right, we will stop there. We will pick up chapter 6. Like I said, we're not going to read all of chapter 7 and chapter 8, but chapter 6 especially, I think, kind of helps to prepare the understanding of who Gideon is. All right, everybody, thanks.